Bien, mesdames, messieurs, je vous invite à prendre place, s'il vous plaît.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I invite you to take your seats?
Afin que nous puissions...
That way we'll be able to start our session on a subject which is very topical, the galaxy of funds and instruments around the EU budget.
Européen. Nous avons souhaité...
Together with the rapporteur, we wanted to reflect on our budget and how easy it is to understand, and the message that can be delivered not only to heads of state and government but also to European citizens. And so for that reason we have invited a number of speakers to introduce 3 different roundtables. The first one will be on the following subject: how the EU budget has developed and what the changes have been over the past 10 years. The introduction will be given by Dr. Giacomo Benedetto, and I would like to thank him for being here and for making a contribution. And then following his presentation there will be a discussion, and I think that session will last approximately 1 hour. And then we will be asking a question about the tools that the budget has for financing the EU's external policies. The introduction will be given by Sebastian Paolo and Elsa Perrault, who are the authors of a briefing document entitled Budgetary Tools for Financing EU External Policies, and then we'll have a general debate. And then part 3 will focus on the European Fund for Strategic Investment as an example of a new type of budgetary instrument. And following the introduction, which will be given by Dr. Ferrer, we will have a debate. And then there will be a 4th part this afternoon, and that will start at around 5:30, 6 o'clock. And there we will try to talk about perspectives for the future on the basis of what we have learned. And there we will be well supported by the recent publication of the report coming out of the high-level group chaired by Mario Monti, and in which Alain Lamassoure, Guy Verhofstadt and Mr. Kalfin participated. So this is a period of reflection. We are at the end of a budget cycle, and all of these financial instruments, all of these trust funds and budget satellites show how difficult it is to reconcile what the Commission wants to do and what the European Union wants to do, and the resources that it has available. We try to have the EU achieve things which it doesn't have the resources to achieve. And I think it is important that we have an opportunity to discuss this and talk about the necessary changes. If there are no questions, I would like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Benedetto, to take the floor.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your invitation, and I'm very pleased to be here today at the European Parliament to present my contribution to this afternoon's debates. My talk over the next 20 minutes or so will be on how the budget has developed and changed during the last decade or so. So my name is Giacomo Benedetto, and I hold the Jean Monnet Chair in European Union Politics at Royal Holloway, University of London. So, in terms of understanding the structure of the budget, what underlies all of it is the presence of own resources, which provide the finance side of the budget. And these amounted in terms of resources available in the financial year of 2015 to 146 billion euro, which was just above the amount spent. So a very small surplus. And where do these funds come from? Well, the vast bulk, as many of us know, come as a residual, as a top-up from gross national income. There is a small part of the resource base which are deemed real own resources or traditional own resources that come from tariffs, and there's a small levy on VAT. Together they make up approximately 1/4 of the finances, although that varies from year to year. And then beneath that, and most controversially, are the system of corrections or rebates, of which the most famous is the one for the United Kingdom. And the presence of the United Kingdom's correction requires net balance contributions for all member states to be analysed and calculated. It is indeed the United Kingdom's correction that has launched a rationale or a reasoning among member states over the last 30 years in calculating what their financial benefit or financial cost vis-à-vis the European Union's budget is. Besides the United Kingdom's own correction, there are 3 other levels of correction which other comparatively wealthy member states have demanded over the years. First of all, there's the rebate on the rebate, which is a discount on the correction that is paid to the United Kingdom by Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, and Sweden. Some countries, Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, and Austria, receive a lump sum discount, and there's a reduced contribution to the value-added tax levy from 3 member states, Germany, the Netherlands, and Sweden. So we have a very complicated system there that perpetuates the continuity until now of the correction or the rebate for the United Kingdom. All of which, as I've said already, contributes to net balance effects. Now, net balance, addressing the net balance, in fact, is a very necessary ingredient for a reform of the EU budget and a reform for the own resources or the revenue system of the EU budget. And indeed, in the report issued last week by the high-level group on own resources, methods for addressing the net balance are at the core of that report as well. Which brings me then on to some of the other aspects within it. The high-level group is recommending a number of proposals for global agreements or package deals in order to reform the revenue or the financial side of the budget as well as the expenditure side. The two go together. Turning now to the expenditure side, the multi-annual financial frameworks used to be known as the financial perspectives. They were put in place in 1988 for periods of between 4, 5 or 7 years. Before the Lisbon Treaty came into effect, the most recent one agreed before then was the financial perspective agreed in 2006 for the 7 years that followed. And the method for agreeing those was that the Commission, the Council and the European Parliament together would agree a package. The Council would have to decide that unanimously, and that the agreement would be subject to ratification in national parliaments afterwards. And this would guarantee maximum levels of spending, or ceilings, over a longer-term period. That was preferable to the situation before 1988, when the budgets were agreed annually, and there was a great deal of instability. And during the 1980s also, there were times in which annual budgets weren't agreed, and there was a resort to provisional 12ths, which were temporary budgets agreed month by month. So introducing those in 1988 was part of that long-term solution. So what would happen if at the end of a financial perspective there were no agreement on a renewal? Well, that didn't ever happen, but I suppose it could have happened. And from the agreement for financial perspectives, it was clear that as a kind of nuclear weapon, as a version of maximum disruption, it was possible for any one of the three institutions, including the European Parliament, to terminate the long-term spending programme. The long-term spending programme would roll over. That was the default position if there wasn't an agreement, but either the Council or the Commission or the Parliament could terminate that rollover, so that you would then return to the situation of before 1988. This is from my understanding of those regulations. This was then transformed by the Lisbon Treaty in 2009 to become the multi-annual financial framework, with a relatively small change in the rules. So the MFF, which was agreed in 2013, was agreed under the following conditions. The sequence, first of all, is different. The European Parliament can effectively co-propose a new MFF with the Commission, because the wording of Article 312 tells us that the Council will agree on the MFF after the Parliament has given its consent. So Parliament's consent comes first, and then the Council's agreement happens afterwards. And depending on how one chooses to interpret this, it gives an almost co-proposal power to the European Parliament alongside that of the Commission. The Council, as before, continues to decide or agree on the MFF unanimously, but there is no more parliamentary ratification at the national level, which allows for a greater degree of flexibility than before. And there is no more the right on any one of the three institutions to terminate the MFF if there isn't an agreement when it expires. Instead, it would merely roll over. The last year's expenditure levels would be carried over to the next year. So that creates a strong bias, incidentally, for continuity and the status quo. The other thing is that by including this inside the treaty in Article 312, the MFF is constitutionalized. The predecessors of the MFF before the Lisbon Treaty were not part of the EU treaties themselves. It was an interinstitutional agreement that governed them. So this is just to deliver one aspect of the negotiation of the MFF. I wanted to point you to the top line, which is labelled in yellow, competitiveness. We see here that in the period between 2007 and 2013, 9% of allocated expenditure was given to competitiveness, to programmes such as research and innovation. The Commission proposed in 2011 to increase that to a 15% share of the total expenditure to match the commitments of the European Union to invest in politics and policies for growth. And the final result, as agreed by the Council in 2013, was a budget share of 13% and not 15%. So we see that there's an increase in competitiveness investment, but the increase is less than what the Commission had proposed. Likewise, we see a reduction in global spending with the new MFF of about 5%. In terms of payments, that's 908 billion rather than 972 billion. So within what is a global reduction in the size of the budget, we see a 2% reduction that goes beyond that in terms of the allocation on money for competitiveness and growth policies. And what we see concerning cohesion policy and agriculture notably is that they are relatively protected compared to what the Commission had proposed. The Council agrees a figure about 1% higher for each of those two policy areas. So these are the two policy areas which seem to have a lot of political protection, but also legal protection, and that's what I'm going to come to next. Because the budget, when the budget is allocated, we have in the European Union a system of double budgeting, commitments and payments. Commitments I define as virtual money. In a sense, it's a token. It's a legal guarantee that money will be supplied for particular projects. Payments, the real money, arrive later. Now, in some cases, the payments arrive almost immediately afterwards, and that's the case in agriculture. That would be almost n+0, in some sense, the same year. But the norm is to go to deliver payments sometime later, up to 3 years later, which is the n+3 principle. Payments are always lower, or usually lower than commitments, because not all conditions have been agreed with. Sometimes partners on the ground aren't able to supply co-financing, and so in general payments are lower. And the difference between commitments and payments is famously known as RAO, or reste à liquider. And one of the factors that makes the predicament for investment, not just in competitiveness, but also in security and justice, perhaps somewhat invidious, is that we have within the budget the notions of differentiated payments and non-differentiated payments. Non-differentiation, which applies to agriculture and to administrative expenditure, means that there doesn't need to be co-financing and that in general payments will follow commitments almost automatically. Differentiated payments are where there is a need for co-funding from partners on the ground, whether it's the recipients of monies under competitiveness, which is heading 1A, or heading 3. And we see that when we're talking of agriculture, it is relatively privileged compared to other expenditure policies. But there's also pre-allocation and non-pre-allocation. Pre-allocation is an agreement that funds will be dispersed to particular member states or regions. And there, again, agriculture benefits, but this time so does cohesion. And everything else is non-pre-allocated. So we have the investments in growth, the investments in public assets under heading 1A is both differentiated, meaning it needs co-financing, and non-pre-allocated. So to look at that agreement as if it were, I'm talking now again of the agreement on the MFF in 2013, it's too simple to say that cohesion and agriculture are protected by powerful member states. It may be the case, but that would not be the only explanation. They are protected also by the legal framework, which gives a particular guarantee to agriculture above other areas of expenditure, followed by cohesion policy. So how does this work out through the annual budget? Well, before 2010, which is when effectively the Lisbon Treaty came into effect, this is how agriculture was divided. So the budget every year would be passed, but always within the limits or the constraints of the financial perspectives and own resources. The ceiling for annual budgetary expenditure was set by the financial perspectives, but the Council, by a qualified majority, could increase that ceiling. And the Parliament was involved in that process as well. It was under the old treaty, Article 279.9. The European Parliament, together with a minority of governments inside the Council with 93 votes, could vote to reduce compulsory expenditure, which was allocated notably towards agriculture, although such payments were legally required. So, yes, this was a power of budget reduction that the Parliament enjoyed, but not necessarily one that could be put into effect if there were a legal requirement to deliver payments. The Council and the European Parliament, in the event of disagreement with each other, instead of a situation which would result in not having a budget, if they disagreed with each other and if the Parliament had a sufficiently large majority, each of the Parliament and the Council could overrule each other, respectively, on non-compulsory expenditure on the part of the Parliament and with regard to compulsory expenditure with regard to the Council. This meant that if the two sides didn't agree, the Council could move to secure its priorities in agricultural direct payments and in some aspects of foreign policy, and on most of the rest of the budget, which was deemed non-compulsory, Parliament, up to the headings, could enforce its preferences. The Parliament also had the right to reject the entire budget by a two-thirds majority. Why would it do this? Well, in recent years, there's no reason why, considering that most expenditure was non-compulsory and Parliament could secure its preferences. In the past, it may have done so in order to try to gain greater control over the rest of the budget. And if that were to happen, incidentally, the Council could also reject a budget, but only at the first reading, simply by not reaching a qualified majority. Then you would have the system of provisional twelfths, which was set under the old Article 273. And this allowed for budgets to be issued for temporary monthly periods based on the previous year's spending. The Council could set those monthly amounts for compulsory expenditure, and the European Parliament could set the monthly amounts for non-compulsory expenditure within the limits of the ceilings. So we see that Parliament could have an opportunity to reject the annual budget and then in provisional twelfths to secure its preferences over most of the expenditure which was non-compulsory. This has now changed. Very quickly, this chart has limited visibility. I'll include it in the written version of my study for the committee. We see under it very simply that, and this is a very simplistic one-dimensional chart. It presupposes that the Commission and the European Parliament want to have more expenditure, and the Council or a minority of governments that could block agreement on the Council want to have less expenditure. And what the chart is showing is that in the event of a disagreement, the European Parliament is able to set non-compulsory expenditure, and the Council, by qualified majority, is able to set compulsory expenditure, which was primarily agriculture, as well as consenting to any increase in spending above the multi-annual ceiling. What's important is who is the member state that can decide whether or not there's a qualified majority. So we have a group of member states that are sometimes called the Friends of Better Spending, or the Nordwijk Group, which were led by the United Kingdom and which included several smaller member states in the north and northwest of Europe. Together, often they were not enough in number to block a qualified majority. If Germany or France voted with them, it was sufficient to block a qualified majority. So we can see the decision maker in terms of those budgetary outcomes in the Council, and the one who determines what the level of compulsory spending is and also whether the ceilings will be exceeded, is most often or most likely going to be Germany if the question is pivotal as to whether or not a qualified majority will form. So, since the Lisbon Treaty came into effect, Again, the annual budget is approved within the ceilings of the own resources and the MFF. The ceiling now, the old Article 279.9 has been deleted, and I don't believe all lawyers are necessarily agree with each other on this question, but there is a view that that means that if the ceiling is going to be exceeded, council unanimity rather than a qualified majority would be required. The European Parliament now has a single reading in the annual budget, and that means that there is less time to negotiate or to set red lines in a way that's constructive. And there is no more distinction between the voting rules for different types of spending. So the notion of compulsory spending and non-compulsory spending has been abolished. European Parliament votes by a majority of its members. What that means is that members who are absent or who abstain are having the same effect as if they vote no. So you always need at least 376 members in order to amend the annual budget. And if the Council and the European Parliament disagree, the budget goes to the Conciliation Committee. And if the Council, with a minority of governments large enough to prevent a qualified majority, or the Parliament don't agree at the Conciliation Committee, there is no budget. The budget has to be reproposed by the Commission. So mutual veto or mutual rejection is very much easier. The European Parliament has a rather far-fetched power to reimpose all of its original amendments if the Council were to change its mind, having agreed provisionally to a budget at the Conciliation Committee, and then later on the Council changes its mind. This is not a realistic proposal. If it were to happen, in fact it wouldn't happen, the very fact is, in my interpretation, is that the Council would see the conciliation procedure as the final stage. And the national governments represented on the Council would never agree, let's say, provisionally to a budget during the course of the Conciliation Committee, because the penalty for the Council in changing its mind would be very high. And this increases the negotiation power of the Council, in my opinion. Okay. But the real dynamite, I would say, which is perhaps not fully regarded, is the new Article 315, which governs provisional twelfths. This is what will happen if there is no budget. So, as I've said, the budget is easier for it to fall and be rejected at the very beginning because actively the Parliament and the Council need to agree to it. So if one of them doesn't agree, there isn't a budget. So then if we have provisional twelfths, and under those circumstances, the Council now sets the spending in those monthly budgets that follow at the beginning of a financial year. And the Parliament's only power is to either freeze or reduce such expenditure. It can't increase it. So the Parliament gains a right to reduce expenditure in provisional twelfths. It loses any right to increase what was once non-compulsory expenditure. And this particular diagram illustrates that, that outcome. We have a situation where the status quo is reinforced, where any one single member state can block an increase above the ceiling in the annual budget, and where the level of spending is effectively imposed by the member of state that can determine whether or not there's a qualified majority. So I talked of France and Germany last time. So rejection overall is easier. Either 15 MEPs on the Conciliation Committee can reject the annual budget, or 4 member states with a minimum population of 179 million people. The Parliament can no longer impose its preferences on what used to be non-compulsory expenditure. The Parliament loses the incentive to reject the budget due to a loss in power that it had to protect what used to be non-compulsory expenditure in provisional twelfths. The Parliament wins a power to reduce or freeze all provisional twelfths. So the Parliament is empowered if the Parliament's wish is to reduce expenditure. So the outcome is, in a sense, we want to know who wants more or less spending, because if the Council wants more spending and the Parliament wants reduced spending, the Parliament wins. The answer is that whoever wants less spending will win. So on this link, which appears on the printed versions of the presentation, are the figures for the annual budget and for every heading since 2007. Between 2007 and 2010, the difference in the preferences for payments that the Council wanted and compared to what the Parliament wanted was around 6%. So Parliament's preferred figure was about 6% higher. That's an average figure. In the 5 years following ratification of the Lisbon Treaty, that difference of 6% shrinks to 3%. So we're seeing that the stated preferences of the Parliament and the Council become closer together. Why that is a matter for debate. It may be that the Parliament is accepting that the figures would not be, that it's less realistic for it to bid for a figure that in the past may have been higher. On commitments, the preferences of the Council and the Parliament are much closer together, and they don't change with the Lisbon Treaty. They stay really very close together. There's not a lot of differentiation between them. And finally, spending, for everything that I've said about how the Council wishes to have lower spending, that's a preference. It's not that the Council wishes to reduce spending, it's that the Council wants to have less spending than what the Parliament would like to see. And that's happened throughout this period. Council has usually wanted to have modest increases every year in the budget, with the exception of the agreement of the MFF in 2013, where there was a real reduction. So if the Council, however, wants a reduction, it has the power to impose it and secure it. And this is what happened in 2011. In 2011, the Council was able to impose its preferences for payments and commitments, both in the agreed budget and in amending budgets later on in the same year. After 2011, the Council was allowed greater funds to flow via commitments and in amending budgets. What the Council kept a very tight control of was the agreed budget. So here is what I think is particularly important to consider. It's not all a negative story, except for the case of 2011. After 2011, the Council wishes a level of expenditure in payments initially to be low. Not commitments, just the payments, in December or November of the previous financial year. Following that, with substantial generosity, the Council allows higher payments to flow to the EU budget in amending budgets. So the Council is operating a system which one could equate to drip feed for meeting the payment obligations of the EU budget. Very quickly, I'll wind up by saying a few words about the euro crisis and some of the mechanisms to deal with that and the effect on the budget. In 2011, this is the year where, as I've said, payments and all other aspects of the budget, including commitments, were very much affected, and the Council imposed its preferences. And also in the negotiation of the MFF in 2013, part of the background there was the discourse of austerity. Notable governments were saying, we've reduced expenditure at national level, European level expenditure must also be reduced. What I'd also say is that some of that power to reduce that expenditure was only realistic because of the changes of the Lisbon Treaty in the annual budgets. The recessions in some countries challenged the basis of national wealth under which own resources are largely constituted. The MFF was reduced by 5% in 2013. Annual budgets on the whole were not reduced, but sometimes were increased below the ceilings. There was an exception. The annual budget of 2014 was a reduction compared to the previous year because it was at the beginning of that new MFF in which the global expenditure had been reduced. The EU's budget also guarantees the EFSM, which is a maximum of 60 billion euro, and a figure now below that level is exposed to any default in Ireland or Portugal. So there was a concern about the liability of the EU budget towards the EFSM, but the EFSM doesn't issue loans any longer, and so it's much less of a concern than it used to be. At the same time, national treasuries, however, and it's national treasuries that like to think they contribute to own resources, national treasuries are exposed to default, if any default happens, within the other two mechanisms for financial solidarity, the EFSF and the ESM. And so that will undoubtedly affect the way that national finance ministers think about the EU budget and the rationale for austerity. So as I've said, the EFSM is established in 2010. Originally, the Commission and the European Central Bank were able to activate or propose to activate a programme for assisting Ireland or Portugal. It was a programme or possibility that lasted until 2013. The Commission and the Central Bank would do a study, they'd then make a recommendation, and a qualified majority in the Council could then launch the sale of bonds in order to provide the necessary finance for those two countries temporarily. There was a guarantee for Greece in 2015, which lasted for only a month. And over time, the EFSM is being wound down. 440 billion euro were guaranteed by national treasuries under the EFSF, which also lasted until 2013. There are no new loans there any longer. It's just existing loans that are being administered. And the liability for the European Stability Mechanism, which was launched in 2013, again, underwritten by national treasuries, is much higher and is above 700 billion euro. So again, this may be focusing the minds or preoccupations of national finance ministers, but they're not affecting directly the EU's budget. So I will terminate at that point.